Number 10. Guantanamo Bay. The Guantanamo Bay detention camp is arguably the most famous prison belonging to the United States. It's located on the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in southeastern Cuba. That's right, this base in Cuba is actually under American control, though it is complicated. It's also a fairly new prison, with construction beginning only back in 2002. In the 21st century, it's been used as a secure facility to hold people that the United States suspected were terrorists. The U.S. forces also placed confirmed terrorists captured outside the country in places like Afghanistan and Iraq into the prison there as well. The reason Guantanamo Bay became so famous is that it's dangerous. There was a huge controversy after it came to light that many of the people being detained inside the camp were not being given proper human rights considerations, with some going so far as to say the staff at Guantanamo Bay were violating Geneva Conventions because they were torturing and abusing the detainees. One of the ways that Guantanamo Bay managed to be such a horrifying place is that it wasn't technically built on United States soil. President George W. Bush's administration said that the prison was not obliged to grant constitutional protection of the prisoners because they were not in U.S. territory and because the Geneva Conventions did not apply to unlawful enemy combatants. Nonetheless, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that Guantanamo was indeed in violation of the Geneva Convention. But this didn't really stop anything from happening. Guantanamo Bay just got even more secretive. For all we know, they could still be torturing people as we speak. It's true that Barack Obama pledged to close the facility in 2009, but in 2018, Donald Trump signed an order to keep the camp open indefinitely. So who knows what'll happen next? Number 9. KWANG Prison. KWANG Prison in Thailand may just be the most brutal prison on the planet. The conditions are harsh and often deadly. The prison itself is located on the outside of Bangkok, built between the years 1927 and 1931. It was meant to be a prison for holding the worst kind of offenders in the country. The inmates here are those who've been sentenced to stay in prison for upwards of 25 years. It's also filled with prisoners waiting to be executed. But before prisoners can be executed, they often die at the hands of other inmates, or they go completely insane. Some reports say that the first 3 months that an inmate is imprisoned here, they're chained with leg irons. This stops them from having the ability to move very well, and so they have to shuffle around with chains around their ankles. Those who have been given the death sentence are stuffed into leg irons and never let out. And they don't die in a very pleasant way either, as the death sentence is usually carried out by a firing squad. One of the weirder things about this prison is the food system. Nothing is free here, and everything except for just a meager bowl of rice and a bit of vegetables must be purchased. This enables wealthy prisoners to employ other prisoners as their servants, and it creates a kind of bizarre hierarchy inside the prison. Throughout Asia, KWANG Prison is known as Big Tiger. Ironically, in some places in the West, it's been called the Bangkok Hilton. Number 8. Alcatraz. Alcatraz is known for a lot of things, primarily for how hard it was to escape. But did you know that Alcatraz was also a seriously dangerous place to be locked up? According to Alcatraz history, one of the things that inmates hated the most about staying on this island prison was the rule of silence. Inmates were prohibited from speaking to one another except during meals and recreation up until the 1930s. Even a single violation, meaning if an inmate spoke a single word, they could be harshly punished. Throughout the history of Alcatraz, which wasn't actually that long because it only functioned for 29 years, 8 people were murdered by other inmates. 5 died by their own hands, while 15 perished from illnesses. That equals 28 unnecessary deaths, or about 1 every year. This number may not seem that shocking, except when you realize that there were only about 250 prisoners at a single time. In total, 1,545 men were imprisoned on the island. And while only 8 were murdered, there were definitely other acts of violence. For example, at least 36 prisoners tried to escape Alcatraz. 2 inmates successfully made it off the island and were captured. 7 were shot to death trying to escape. 2 drowned in the water between the island and the mainland, and 5 inmates went missing and were never found, presumed dead and swept away into the ocean. Number 7. Urumqi No. 3 Detention Center. The Urumqi No. 3 Detention Center in China has been described as the largest prison in the country and a place that is worse than hell. I'm talking torture, electrocution, brainwashing, and disturbing incidents with cattle prods. According to some recent reports, the prison is currently filled with thousands of Uyghur Muslims, with estimates being at least 10,000 people have been subjected to some degree of torture. To give you an idea of just how huge this detention center is, it's over 220 acres. That's twice the size of Vatican City. Satellite images have shown a dramatic increase in size since 2019, with nearly a mile of buildings added to the detention facility. Amnesty International released a report that described the center as a dystopian hellscape. One of the teachers at the facility told reporters that people were tortured with iron chairs and electric batons. The prisoners here are forced to watch Chinese Communist Party history over and over as a form of mind control. The director of the center, Zhu Hongbin, actually came out and admitted that they control everything the prisoners watch. He also went on to say that the prisoners are unbreakable and that they need to be taught why it's bad to commit crimes. But there are two different interpretations of this giant prison. The Chinese say it's filled with murderers and thieves, while outside research claims it's actually full of innocent people who've been detained for crimes such as attending the wrong religious gathering or visiting the wrong country. These innocent people are then tortured, manipulated, and robbed of their humanity. So what would you do if you were imprisoned for a crime you didn't commit? Would you try to escape? Would you try to ride out your sentence, or maybe try something else? Tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. Then remember to subscribe to World List if you haven't already for more intense videos just like this one. Number 6. Sabaneta Prison. When talking about violence, there's almost no worse place to be imprisoned than Venezuela. Specifically, the Sabaneta prison is one of the most murderous places in the entire world. According to a recent report from the BBC, 16 prisoners were killed in one day of violence in the Midwestern city of Maracaibo when fighting broke out in the prison between rival gangs. But this was not gang violence like you see on American TV. This was not a return to Oz. The inmates in this case were beheaded. Some of them had their limbs literally ripped off their bodies, and it could be that some of the bodies were even bitten as though wild dogs attacked them. The minister of the prison, Iris Varela, said the violence came from an internal war raging inside the jail. The prison was extremely overencumbered, with about 3,700 inmates inside a building designed to house only 700. It was recently shut down, though it's unclear exactly how Venezuela will maintain order if its prisons are overcrowded and getting shuttered. If you thought U.S. prisoners had it bad, just wait until you hear these statistics. First of all, Venezuela has one of the highest crime rates in the world. The prison population is exploding out of control, and 80% of the prisons in Venezuela are actually run by the inmates themselves, who are often armed with weapons and dramatically outnumber the actual security forces. At places like Sabaneta Prison, a violent death is almost a guarantee. Number 5. Black Dolphin Prison. Black Dolphin Prison is considered the toughest and hardest in all of Russia. It's a high-security facility located on the border of Kazakhstan, known for harboring the most brutal and dangerous criminals in Russia, including cannibals, terrorists, and serial killers. A prison lieutenant recently told National Geographic that the only way to escape Black Dolphin is by dying. There are about 700 inmates locked up in this prison, but just listen to this. The 700 inmates have killed about 3,500 people collectively, or about 5 murders per prisoner. That's a pretty terrifying rate. The inmates here are imprisoned for life, like Vladimir Nikolaev, who's doing a full life sentence in Black Dolphin for killing a man during a fight and then eating his corpse. The prisoners here are kept under full surveillance 24 hours a day. Each cell is locked inside of a different secure cell, and guards check on the inmates every 15 minutes. When prisoners are allowed to leave their cells, they must walk bent over at a 90-degree angle with their eyes looking at the floor. And if they're ever allowed outside, they can only do so blindfolded. In Black Dolphin, it's not the other inmates that'll kill you, even though they would probably really like to. Instead, it's the psychological torture that kills. Number 4. Columbia Correctional Institution. The Columbia Correctional Institution is one of the most dangerous prisons anywhere in America. And since it's Florida, you know it's full of dangerous weirdos too. To prove the point, an inmate recently strangled his cellmate to death, then ripped out his eyes, mutilated his dead body, and made a necklace out of the victim's body parts before heading off to the dining hall to eat breakfast. This guy hasn't yet been named, and he's only one of the hundreds of dangerous criminals housed inside of this prison. His victim was Larry Mark, 58 years old and in prison since 1981 for committing robbery and murder. The guy who killed him was apparently angry because Larry had been annoying him. At this correctional institution, being annoyed means getting your eyeballs pulled out of your head. But the day was even worse. As one violent murder wasn't enough, corrections officers said that earlier in the day, before the brutal slaying of Larry, there was another melee that erupted between 2 armed gangs. Members of the Bloods and the Cutthroats got into a fight in which several men had their throats slashed and their bodies filled with stab holes. Number 3. KEROBOKAN, Bali Prison. Bali is known for its sandy beaches, unparalleled nature, and thousands of partying backpackers. But just a few miles away from the whole food cafes and bars on the beach, there's a living hell known as KEROBOKAN Bali Prison. The facility was designed to hold 300 prisoners, though today there are over 1,400 inside of its walls. Many of the inmates sleep on hard floors in the blistering heat, so crowded that men are forced to sleep in uncomfortable tangles. To the locals, the prison is known as Hotel K. The majority of the prisoners are drug offenders, people accused of using things like cannabis and cocaine. And they don't take foreigners coming to their island to use drugs very lightly. There was an Australian convicted back in 2005 of smuggling cannabis into Bali, and she was sentenced to spend 20 years in KEROBOKAN prison, though she only actually served 9. One of the most famous foreign prisoners to get stuck inside this hellhole was Ronnie Ramsey, Chef Gordon Ramsay's brother. He was caught in Bali with heroin and sentenced in 2007 to spend a bit of time in prison. But why is this so horrible? Well, there aren't really any rules. Prisoners are often found hanging in their cells, covered in vomit and flies. The men all share gross, squat toilets that are so poorly maintained that there is literal human waste bubbling out of them. Oh yeah, and it's also filled with rats. Number 2. MILLHAVEN Institution. The MILLHAVEN Institute is one of the most dangerous prisons anywhere in Canada. It apparently used to be a place full of violence, but violence with rules. David Rose, a convicted murderer, recently gave news reporters some insight on how the violence in the institution used to play out. According to David, who by the way is spending the rest of his life in prison, back in the old days, inmates used to have a code of conduct. They would fight and be violent with one another, but would also be respectful. David said that in recent years that code of conduct has collapsed and has made the prison significantly more dangerous than it has ever been before. According to him, none of the old rules apply to the new inmates. And it's funny that he says this because there have been a recent 15% jump in violent assault in the past 3 years alone. In the last year, there were 15,330 federal offenders guilty of violent crimes in Canada, with the most dangerous being housed in MILLHAVEN. As it appears, prison is actually getting worse and more dangerous, not better at rehabilitation, even in Canada. Number 1. The Clink. The term the Clink refers to jail, but what a lot of people don't know is that the Clink is a very real jail, the name of a prison in the 14th century in England. Nobody's exactly sure where the name came from, though some historians speculate that the jail was called Clink because of the sound made by the blacksmith's hammer as it closed the irons around a person's wrists and ankles. Others believe the Clink was named after the sound of the inmates clinking their drinking cups against the bars. In any case, the Clink is one of the worst prisons of all time. It operated from between 1151 until the year 1780. Because the jailers didn't make very much money, they were open to all kinds of bribes. If you couldn't afford food or bedding from the jailers, you were forced to starve to death and sleep on the floor. In fact, the poorest of the prisoners were forced to beg through the iron bars that led to the level of the street for anything that people passing by would give. The result of this disgusting place was rampant disease and violence, with many of the prisoners getting sick, being forced to eat rats, and dying pretty miserably. This story comes from Indonesia in the village known as Sulawesi, where someone was literally swallowed whole by a massive snake, in this case a giant python. The woman in question was 54-year-old Wa Tiba. She was checking out her vegetable garden when suddenly she vanished from sight. As the villagers looked around, they found her sandal and her machete. As they continued to search, they found a reticulated python, and it had a rather abnormally large belly that clearly had something or someone in it. They killed the snake and then took it to a place where they could film gutting it, and when they did, they were shocked to find Wa Tiba inside. The python wrapped itself around her, constricting her. She wouldn't be able to breathe, let alone scream. This allowed the snake to easily swallow her whole. One can only imagine the thoughts of the villagers after finding Wa Tiba like this. This actually happens more than you think, too. Snakes are able to swallow very large prey, especially if the snake itself is as big as this python was. There are multiple documented stories of serpents swallowing goats, cows, alligators, and yes, also people. Number 9. MILO SUTCLIFFE. Picture this, you're minding your own business in the comfort of your own home, and you look out your window to see an unwanted guest slithering into your backyard. The snake is a major threat to you and your family, so you decide to go and do the rational thing. You kill it. In the case of MILO SUTCLIFFE, he killed the snake he found with a shovel, decapitating it. In case you're curious, yes, the cut the head off the snake and the body dies line is an accurate one. But there is a twist here, because not unlike certain parts of the human body, if you aren't careful, a certain body part can still react even after being severed from the rest of itself. Kind of like a chicken running around with its head cut off, but in this case, it was a dangerous snake. Thinking he had killed it, he went to pick up the head of the snake, but that turned out to be the worst mistake of his life. The rattlesnake's head still had signs of life, and getting its final revenge, it bit Sutcliffe with everything it had. Now, there is a difference between getting bit by a live snake and a soon-to-be dead one. A live snake can regulate its venom delivery, and will keep some back, but a headless one, well, obviously it's going to give you whatever it has because it won't be needing it anyway. Sutcliffe was poisoned so badly he needed 26 doses of antivenom and even spent 5 days in a medically induced coma. Number 8. The obsession of Bill HAAST. There are many people who love to study snakes. They're known as herpetologists. For Bill HAAST, he wasn't that, but rather an obsessed collector of snakes from all around the world. And we do mean around the world. He would apparently go to places like South America and Africa and find snakes to add to his weird collection. He eventually collected so many of them that he owned his own serpentarium, where he would not only showcase his wide variety of snakes, he would drain them of their venom for those that paid him to do so. This is where several twists come in, because you might think, there's no way he didn't get bit by those snakes, right? Well, you're correct. In fact, he was bit by snakes over 170 times, and many of them were venomous snakes. So how did he survive? Well, apparently he was bitten so much that he had an immunity to some of the snake venom. Believe it. In fact, he would help this along by willingly injecting himself with the venom so his body could get used to it. To everyone's shock and amazement, he lived to be 100 years old. Number 7. Teen versus inland taipan. In terms of pure venom, the deadliest snake on the planet is the inland taipan. This snake has a kind of toxin that is perfect for killing warm-bodied beings. You know, like us humans. In 2012, near Sydney, Australia, there was a very unlucky teenager who was bitten by the taipan and was able to survive, which is actually kind of a miracle. One bite from this snake in almost all instances will kill you in less than an hour. So how did this young lad survive a bite from this deadly creature? Well, fortunately for him, he was very close to the hospital when he was bitten, so they were able to give him the life-saving antidote. But wait, there is another twist here, because the inland taipan should not be found in Sydney. They're usually found in areas very far away from there in regard to Australia at least, and thus it's believed that this one was kept as a pet and then let loose. What kind of maniac keeps an inland taipan as a pet? Well, your guess is as good as ours. Number 6. An evening with the MAMBAS. Mess with cobras, rattlesnakes, or even pythons and you might just get away with it. But never, ever mess with a black mamba. Black mambas can grow up to 14 feet in length, and they can move at a high speed of 12.5 miles per hour. Their venom can and will kill you in 10 minutes flat. If you live in black mamba territory, make sure your home is an anti-snake fortress, because it's better to be safe than sorry. Chiposat Adomo from Kenya learned about black mambas the hard way. She was walking home from a party in her hilly village of Chirangan, in Kenya's West Pokot County, close to the Ugandan border. It was dark, and suddenly a 6.5-foot black mamba coiled around her foot and bit her 3 times. What terrified her even more was the presence of 2 more black mambas who thought of approaching Adomo as if barging into an uninvited dinner. Luckily, help appeared out of nowhere in the crazy form of a man with a machete, taking out the duo before they could join in on the fun. The 3rd black mamba had already fled away. Adomo began losing her vision and soon started fainting. The man managed to get her to the hospital in the nick of time, where she was given antivenom. Thankfully, she survived, but I can't say the same for almost 30,000 people who die in Kenya from snake bites every single year. Number 5. Lorraine Johnson. Lorraine Johnson was hiking between Los Angeles and the Santa Monica Mountains when all of a sudden, a snake camouflaged in the brush around her feet slithered out and bit her. She actually noticed the snake a split second before, but it was too late to try and avoid it. And even worse, it was a venomous rattlesnake. Within seconds, I started feeling the effects: blurred vision, jelly-like legs, and a horrifying sense of panic, wrote Lorraine, recounting her horrific ordeal for Backpacker magazine. While it wasn't her fault she got bit, she absolutely picked the wrong time to go into that area. The spot was known for being infested with rattlesnakes. She went on this hike after work, which was apparently the time of day when the snakes like to bask in the evening light and feel the cool temperature. She was almost asking for it. And it was quite the ordeal after getting bit. The snake that bit me injected a standard issue hemotoxin, along with a rare and more powerful neurotoxin that quickly interfered with my brain's signals to my respiratory system, she says. I didn't know it at the time, but I had to get help fast if I was going to survive. Thankfully, she did, but not without a bit of luck on her side. She was able to flag down some drivers who took her to a nearby hospital so she could start the healing process. Within an hour of my bite, the doctors administered the first of 116 vials of antivenom that would ultimately save my life, the victim recalled. By her own admission, if she had been deeper into her hike, she likely would have died, as she wouldn't have gotten to the hospital in time. Number 4. AKBAR SALUBIRO. This next story might sound familiar, as it's very similar to what happened to Watiba. It was a typical day in his village for AKBAR SALUBIRO from Indonesia when he set off to his fields for a harvest. But when his family found him missing for an unusual length of time, they decided to investigate. They gathered a search party and ventured out into the fields where they came upon his shed, and what they saw inside shocked them to their core. Slithering around on the floor was a massive reticulated python at least 23 feet in length. There was also a bulge in the python's belly that suggested it had just had its meal for the day, and a pretty large meal at that. Snakes like this swallow their food whole and digest it over the next few days as the food breaks down in their stomachs. Fearing that it could be AKBAR, the villagers caught the python and split it open. It was indeed their missing friend. The python had crushed him to putty and was in the process of digesting him before the villagers discovered what the hungry serpent had done. We can only assume the snake had been starving, and it turned out AKBAR was an easy meal. Number 3. Janice Taylor. Janice Taylor is sadly another victim of snake bites, but unlike some of the ones previously detailed, hers was quite the ordeal in terms of how she got bit and how that bite affected her. You see, she was not bit in the usual way. Taylor was an avid bowler, and one night she was at the bowling club and she suddenly felt something on her foot. At the time, she thought she'd been bitten by a spider. She shook it off and continued to bowl. Except she was not bitten by a spider, but a snake, whose venom went through her body and made her collapse face first on the floor. Ouch. Later on, it was revealed that she had gotten bitten by a brown snake, which is the second most venomous snake in the world by certain people's metrics. This would explain why she fell to the ground so quickly after being bit. What was a snake doing at the bowling alley, though? I feel like there's a punchline to this one somewhere. The venom of the brown snake made her face not just swell, but start to bleed. The doctors didn't think she had a very good chance to survive. Thankfully, she did, though. And after that experience, she became an advocate for having that bowling club and other surrounding stores to put up warning signs about snakes in the area, so that others won't have to fear getting bit like she was. Number 2. The zoo's python. Hearing that there is a snake at a zoo is not concerning at all. Zoos are a great place to learn about snakes and see them up close and personal in ways that you can't and shouldn't do in the natural world. The catch, though, is that the zookeepers technically can get even closer to these snakes, and it usually ends terribly for them if they're dumb enough to try. For reasons unknown to man and science, employee Eric Arrieta was going past the enclosure of a Burmese python and felt the need to open up its cage in order to get closer to it. Again, why would he feel such an urge is kind of beyond us, but it was 100% against the rules to do such a thing. And he did it in the middle of the night, so there was no one around to help him should something go wrong. And naturally, something went wrong. And the next morning, his co-workers arrived at the zoo to find the python fully wrapped around Eric's body, attempting to eat him whole, starting with its head, which we're pretty sure already didn't have a brain in it. The young man underestimated the animal's instincts, said Javier Hernandez, Director General of the Parque del Este Zoo. And yeah, that is one way of putting it. Number 1. Snake in the toilet. There are a lot of urban myths about snakes, and some of them are just plain sad. But one of them that seems like a myth but actually isn't is that some snakes come up through toilets for a very surprising and sometimes very painful visit while you're doing your business. For example, there was a man in Thailand who went to use the toilet, sat down to, do what you do, and then got bitten by a python in his family jewels. He apparently bled profusely and had to be taken to the hospital. End of story? Well, not so much. One of the people in the rescue party for this man noted that in Thailand, this happens quite often, which is honestly rather horrifying. The sad thing here is that it's not hard to see how this could happen. The snake gets into a pipe, and it follows the pipe up until it reaches an opening, which just so happens to be the toilet. This has happened more than once in countries all over the world. There were even cases of this in 2021 in places like Austria. So if you're using a bathroom toilet and you're not familiar with it, do be careful and check out what you're sitting on and what's in it before doing your business. It's only human to be interested in the strange, and it comes as no surprise that people all over the world are fascinated by creepy, abandoned places. Adventurers known as urban explorers go out and discover all sorts of buildings that have been discarded by society. But it's not just a single building. A lot of the time, entire facilities are sometimes left just to sit and collect dust. Just like the Discovery Island theme park created decades ago by none other than Disney. Discovery Island stays true to its name and resides on a private island outside of Bay Lake, Florida. The park was originally known as Treasure Island back in the 70s, and was actually open and enjoyed by families all over. However, after Animal Kingdom in Disney World opened in 1999, Treasure Island was completely abandoned. For years, it was strictly guarded and no one was permitted to enter, but one explorer was able to sneak in and document their experience. He took pictures of his discoveries and put them online for the world to see. The once vibrant theme park had become overrun with vegetation, and its once upon a time happy-looking buildings were now crumbling. Since the main attraction of the area back in the 70s was its wildlife, there was an animal hospital there to take care of them. The explorer found the hospital still standing, surprisingly with coolers still inside containing medications and supplies for the animals. Other parts of the building were in ruins though. After over 20 years, Discovery Island has finally been rediscovered, although it's not nearly up to par with Disney's current standards. Number 10. Skulls in the UK. Two well-known urban explorers from YouTube met a grisly surprise while filming one of their new videos. The husband and wife duo, Danny and Felicity Duffy, were looking into an abandoned pub in the Greater Manchester area of the United Kingdom when they found a human skull. It was sitting out in the woods near a discarded army jacket. Danny picked it up on camera to get a better look, an action that would later receive a bit of backlash from viewers, saying it was disrespectful to disturb it. After realizing what exactly they'd found, the two called local authorities. They told the police that they weren't sure if it was real, but it definitely looked real. Once officers arrived at the scene and investigated, they took the object out to be studied further by the forensics teams. Here it was determined the skull was indeed real. As veteran explorers, this was the first time the Duffys had seen anything like this. They have since told viewers that they'll be taking a break from urban exploring and YouTube to recover from this traumatic experience. Number 9. Six Flags of New Orleans. Known as some of the kings of roller coasters, Six Flags locations have dominated the amusement park scene in America for decades. But did you know that one Six Flags location actually sits completely abandoned? In New Orleans, there's rides that have been left to rust since 2005. Ever since the disaster that was Hurricane Katrina, the park had only been open for 5 years before having to close its doors due to excessive flooding and damage. Being built in an area known for storms, you'd kind of think they would have been better prepared. And that's the thing, they were. They had coasters designed to stand up to hurricane-strength winds and metal risers to prevent animal damage. Even with anti-flooding systems, Six Flags New Orleans still had to close. Once the storm started pouring in, the systems in place started failing really quickly. Although the park closed, security remains in place to deter intruders, but that hasn't stopped everyone. Pictures have popped up online in all corners of the internet of rookie explorers trying to get a look inside. Those that were successful saw roller coasters untouched next to carousels missing panels and swings. The park still sits frozen in time. So if you're feeling adventurous and aren't scared of security, maybe try and take a peek yourself. Although we don't really recommend it. Sounds illegal! Number 8. Vet School. One urban explorer named Stéphane Bernard discovered more than he bargained for when he found an abandoned veterinary school. Located in Anderlecht, Brussels, the stuff he found inside could give even the biggest horror enthusiasts nightmares. So if you get sick to your stomach easily, be warned. After being untouched for decades, the building houses old lecture halls full of outdated theater-style chairs and long empty hallways. The worst part, though, was downstairs. Stefan and his companions did everything they could not to puke as they headed into the dimly lit and putrid-smelling basement. The stench of old formaldehyde was everywhere, as they found countless containers full of dead animal parts in glass jars, nearly 100 years old. Some of the creatures they found were unrecognizable, and others were science experiments gone wrong, like the head of a calf attached to a cat's leg. There were whole animals, organs, brains, you name it, they had it, and all of them had been sitting in the dark, left to fester in chemicals for a century. Number 7. Ganjiam Hospital. Every ghost show in existence has visited at least one old mental hospital. So it just makes sense that there's one on this list too. The Gangnam Psychiatric Hospital in South Korea has been listed as one of the most haunted places in the country. Legends of patients dying in mysterious ways have helped contribute to the building's fame and eventually led to its closure in the 1990s. The legends were one reason, but the economy and work conditions were the main ones. Despite being closed to the public, thousands of people break into the hospital every year to take a peek at the spooky corridors. The facility was left mostly intact, with its machines, beds, and medical equipment lingering inside bed chambers and old rooms. But a lot of the building is deteriorating, with floorboards coming up and ceilings falling down. A South Korean film was even made about the hospital, called Gangnam Haunted Asylum, locking in its reputation. Have you seen that creepy movie? Are you gonna watch it now? I probably won't, but let us know in the comments section down below if you're liking this video, and be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. VILVOORDE Prison. Prisons are notorious for being creepy, whether they currently have prisoners in them or whether the prisoners haven't been there for hundreds of years. The VILVOORDE prison has centuries of history, first being constructed all the way back in 1779, originally under the control of the Austrian Netherlands. Historians believe that more than 12,000 people could have been jammed into the cells at one point or another on one of the 4 floors. They weren't picky about who was thrown behind bars either. Drunks, prostitutes, tramps, anyone who was a nuisance was thrown into VILVOORDE. There wasn't a lot of light able to shine through the window slits inside the bars either. Prisoners were forced into labor for re-education purposes and used to turn items such as wool, cotton, and hemp into sellable products. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the facility served as a military hospital, a barracks during World War I, a detention center, and eventually a few decades ago, it was made into a historic monument. In the now abandoned prison turned tourist site, scratches on the walls from past prisoners still haunt the cells, counting the days until freedom, or who knows. Number 5. Jonestown. If you're unfamiliar with the tragic disaster that was Jonestown, well, let us introduce you to it. In the 70s, a man named Jim Jones led a large cult called the People's Temple. Jones was a charismatic narcissist that convinced hundreds of his followers to move out to Guyana in South America and build their own little paradise. For a short time, it seemed like that too. They had their own farms and houses, as well as a community center where Jones would lead sermons and preach. But everything took a turn in 1978, when Jones managed to convince 909 of his members, including some of the children, to drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. After authorities removed the bodies and cleaned up the crime scene, the small community they had built went untouched. Close to a port town named Katuma, what remains of Jonestown is an eerie reminder of the tragedy that took place. Empty huts that once served as living quarters, a forgotten pavilion, and even the chair of Jones himself remain. The sign that once welcomed excited cult members ready to start their new life in paradise still stands, reading "Welcome to the People's Temple, Jonestown." Other than that, most of the area is just overgrown with jungle and rusting. One explorer who decided to visit the site mentioned how chilling it was. As I picked my way through the chest-high bushes growing in the area where the pavilion once stood, what struck me most was the silence. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Even with vegetation overtaking the once vibrant settlement, the air of Jonestown still remembers the horrors that once took place there. Number 4. HASHIMA Island. Yet another island, HASHIMA sits about 9 miles from the city of Nagasaki, which was hit in 1945 by an atomic bomb during World War II. HASHIMA Island was originally known for its underwater coal mining and was a symbol of Japan's industrial edge. It was also known as Battleship Island for its close resemblance to a warship. It was opened from 1887 and closed down nearly a century later in 1974. People simply started to leave after the coal reserves were running dry. Virtually left alone for decades, explorers quickly became interested in the island's mysteries, one of those being a dark history. The workers of the coal mine were often submerged in harsh working environments, and over 1,000 fell victim to malnutrition, exhaustion, and poor conditions, dying on that lonely island. Visitors to the island will witness massive, cramped apartment complexes built out of concrete, overrun with plants, looking like something from an apocalyptic wasteland. Number 3. Gulliver's Kingdom. Continuing with the theme park trend, Gulliver's Kingdom in Japan sits underneath the infamous Mount Fuji and is based off the tales of the book Gulliver's Travels. It opened back in 1997 and was open for a brief period of 10 years. The park was created to boost the economy near the Yamanashi Prefecture and was temporarily successful in creating construction jobs, but long-term employment was not kept up very well. Sadly, location was one of the main downfalls of the park. Japan's suicide forest is in close proximity to Gulliver's Kingdom, making it seem cursed. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the close village Kimikushiki was the center of the Aum Shinriko cult and nerve gas production. So yeah, it wasn't all that enticing. Nothing remains in the park now other than the massive, haunting 147.5-foot-long statue of Gulliver, tied down, laying on the ground in the center of the debris. After sitting isolated for so long, Gulliver is covered in graffiti and serves as an unsettling reminder of the park's existence. Number 2. Pripyat. Chernobyl is the biggest nuclear meltdown incident to have ever taken place on our planet. The extent of damage the blast did is still unknown, but it's estimated that thousands and thousands of people were killed from radiation itself or related injuries. The town of Pripyat was home to employees of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and was extremely close to the facility. At its peak, about 49,000 people called the town home in 1985. A year later, when the blast hit, no one knew just how bad it was. A day after the blast, buses came in droves to evacuate Pripyat's residents, causing them to leave their homes and much of their belongings behind to escape the nuclear fallout. Scientists estimate the area won't be inhabitable for at least another 24,000 years. So there's no going back for past residents. Legally, that is. Despite the risk of radiation, people still have snuck into the abandoned city to document the changes and witness the Chernobyl experience for themselves. Photos from these brave and fairly stupid explorers show haunting depictions of deserted kindergartens full of dolls and teddy bears, empty pools, and gymnasiums lined with discarded shoes and sporting equipment. The site of the meltdown itself has also been explored to the horror of many. We definitely don't recommend going there yourself, though, unless you have some sort of death wish. Number 1. North Brother Island. Unknown to many outside of the Bronx in New York lies an abandoned island that was once home to Riverside Hospital. The isolated medical center was opened up in the 1880s and was a home to those suffering from contagious diseases. Those with tuberculosis, yellow fever, smallpox, typhus, and even more were sent to quarantine on North Brother Island. One famous patient named Typhoid Mary was the first documented case of being an asymptomatic carrier for typhus. Because of this, she unknowingly spread the sickness to over 25 different people. Upon discovery, she was quarantined until her death 18 years later from pneumonia. Over 1,000 people have died in the hospital after a steamship accident in 1905. And who knows how many others died from various illnesses. After the Second World War, it was used as a housing facility for war veterans, and then was converted into a treatment center for heroin addicts. Years later, in 1963, it was closed and hasn't been open to the public since. Officially now, it's a bird sanctuary for black-crowned night herons, but unofficially, it's a dream location for urban explorers. Photos reveal the buildings on the island to be run down and overgrown, one showing thousands of books littered on the floor, and others showing large open rooms with chairs still set up as if ghosts still sit on them. Thanks for watching. What did you think of these abandoned places and what was found inside of them? Would you ever consider visiting one of these places? Do you know about any other locations and items that should have made our list? Let us know in the comments section down below. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.